is Dennis Dabney. My name is Dennis Dabney, and I will be the moderator for this session. I would like to first thank all of you for joining, and a special thank you to Kimberly Lawrence, David Autor, and Rebecca Dixon for being the panelists on this, this Zoom meeting. So I want to start off by taking people back to March of 2019. So this is all about what happens to the workforce and to work after COVID. And so I want to take you all back to March of 2019. It just seems crystal clear to me in my head how things went, because it was crazy as far as I was concerned. You may remember all the increased reported cases of COVID in the United States. All of a sudden, hospitals started filling to capacity. There were low levels of mask and PPE equipment for healthcare workers. There was a short supply of respirators for people. And then, of course, when things are bad, the scammers all come out, and we started having all kinds of scams with people trying to sell personal protective equipment that wasn't the right kind of equipment. Workers got sent home, some with pay, some without. And then we really started understanding who was essential and what was essential. So healthcare workers during this kind of crisis are essential. Grocery workers are essential. Trash pickup is essential. And so there's a number of essential services that had to continue working through this pandemic and through the unknown. And we went through that for probably 8 or 9 months, and we tried to get adjusted. And every time we tried to adjust, something new would happen, more cases. People started working on vaccinations and vaccines. And I remember when the vaccine first came out, you know, people were trying to find ways to cut lines. Foreigners were flying into Florida, getting vaccinations. And we moved from that to a period where we're now trying to get people to continue to get the vaccination. So we've come a long way through this COVID year. California just announced that they plan to continue wearing masks when people return to work up until October. So let me introduce you to the panel. They're going to discuss how all of this will shape the future of work. And the format that we're going to use for the discussion today, I'm going to introduce the first speaker. I'll do a little bio, do a summary of what they're going to talk about. And then I'll let them speak. I'll introduce the next speaker. When they're done, do the same thing, bio, summary, they'll speak. And then in the end, we're going to do a Q&A. So I'm going to monitor the chat box for Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, just type them in the chat box. So our first speaker is going to be Kimberly Lawrence. And Kimberly has 25 years of expertise as a global employment attorney, litigator, and compliance officer. Kimberly is Vice President, Senior Counsel, Labor and Employment at CVS Health. In this role, Kimberly leads a team of senior attorneys, paralegals, and administrative staff. She is responsible for a myriad of labor and employment law matters and works closely with human resources, cross-functional business partners, and C-suite executives to provide advice and counsel on labor and employment claims and litigation. She has numerous other positions that she's held. I'm going to move from her intro, it is very long, to a summary. So what she's going to talk about is in this new normal, as work begins, people begin to return to work, what happens in the workplace? What are some of the legal considerations for employers to consider? So with that, Kimberly, please start.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for the invitation to present today. So much has transpired over the past year related to COVID and the COVID vaccinations, and how employers are starting to rethink what is a return to the workplace going to look like. We've seen over just the past few weeks updated CDC guidance on fully vaccinated employees and individuals being able to shed their mask. We've seen the EOC issue updated guidance on mandating vaccinations. And you may have seen that there have been a number of industries and companies doing surveys in trying to determine, what will employers require in the workplace as employees begin to return to the workplace. And some employers are considering mandating vaccinations. Other employers are considering asking employees to attest to their vaccination status upon returning to the workplace. And again, there's a lot of discussion about employees being able to shed their mask if they're fully vaccinated. Just the other week, the EOC issued updated pandemic guidance that says that employers can lawfully require employees to get the vaccine before returning to the workplace and as a condition of employment. And with that comes a caveat that if an employer does require employees to be vaccinated, they have to allow for exemptions. So if an employee is unable or unwilling to get the vaccine because there's a mandated policy, then the employer has to consider whether or not the employee has a sincerely held religious belief or practice, or whether or not the employee says, I cannot or I'm unable to get the vaccine because I have a medical condition or disability. And for employers that go down this path of mandating the vaccination and considering exemptions, they also need to consider that part of the reasonable accommodation process for employees is they have to engage in what we call the interactive dialogue, meaning they have to understand from the employee what is the prohibition from them getting the vaccine, and is this reasonable? Can we provide some type of accommodation? And then a reasonable accommodation might look like allowing an employee to continue to work from home, allowing an employee to show up in the workplace but just still wearing PPE, or if that industry or the role is such that it presents a direct threat to other employees for that unvaccinated person to be there, there may be a situation where they may consider termination of that person's employment. But again, following the legal standards that your HR professionals and attorneys might advise, these are considerations that an employer deciding to mandate the vaccine would have to consider. The EOC also has made it clear that employers need to be very careful because this is federal guidance, and there will also be state laws and local laws and just public health guidance that may dictate a different response from employers. And there's also things like alternatives to mandating the vaccine that a number of employers are considering, and that is just strongly encouraging the vaccine in the workplace. Others are implementing really strong educational initiatives. Some are setting up vaccination sites on their premises, so employees have ready access to the vaccines if they come back into the workplace. And again, there's a lot of discussion about allowing fully vaccinated employees to return to the workplace without their mask. Some are using the honor system, which means they're not asking for attestation. And some employers are going to be asking for employees to certify that they have been vaccinated and then allowing them to shed their mask. Some considerations for employers to think about whether or not it's mandating the vaccine or asking employees to attest to vaccines is philosophical considerations, because as we've seen play out in the press and in the news, there's a lot of oppositions to vaccines, whether it's philosophical, moral, ethical, political differences, and that may spill over into the workplace. And so employers, I think, are trying to navigate this as we have employees return to the workplace, because that is something that could be very disruptive in the workplace. And so employers may want to poll their employees and understand what's going to happen if they try to attempt to mandate the vaccine or ask for attestations. And some may not wish to poll and may just want to proceed but it's also very dependent on the industry. Some other considerations for employers, depending on again, the industry and maybe where they're located is that you have federal OSHA guidance. You also have state OSHA that may dictate what employers can do. And we're still waiting for guidance from like federal OSHA. Different states haven't made a decision. I think Cal OSHA has come out with some guidance that is not as broad as the CDC guidance about masks, but all of those will influence what employers may or may not do. You also have the issue of workers' compensation, and workers' compensation is very state specific as it relates to employees in the workplace. And so it remains to be seen if an employer decides to mandate, vaccinations or ask for attestation. If an employee does get a vaccine and has an adverse reaction, will there be claims that because of the program the employer has implemented that, the person says, I got an adverse reaction because you implemented this program and I would not, but for you having this mandatory program, I would not have had this adverse reaction to the vaccine. So again, a lot to be seen as we go down this path. There's also torts considerations. So it still, again, remains to be seen what a plaintiff's attorney might do if an employer does mandate vaccinations. They may try to claim that employer breached their duty because they mandated a program or they didn't mandate a program. I just imagine that there are a lot of attorneys out here just kind of waiting to see how employers may or may not step in it because this is all very novel and no one's been here before. And the biggest issue is state law because every state law, of course, will be different. And some states may follow the EOC guidance and say, absolutely, employers should have the ability to mandate vaccinations and ask for vaccination status. Others may rule differently. And so we've seen in Montana in May just came down with a law that says it prohibits employers from asking employees their vaccination status and also prohibits them from making vaccinations a condition of employment. So Montana is the first state out the gate that's making this a prohibition. And I suspect we'll start to see more states kind of with similar positions. Another consideration is unions. So employers that have a unionized work setting, there may be some obligations to negotiate with the unions if employer wants to mandate vaccines or wants to move ahead with vaccination as stations, and you may have to bargain over the implementation of this type of program. And lastly, there are also privacy and record keeping considerations for employers as they navigate kind of this new world order. If employers do move forward with wanting vaccination attestations or mandating vaccines, the EOC, and there will also be state laws that really require that any information related to the vaccine is considered medical. And so that information must be held in secure confidential files outside of an employee's personnel file. So it's really important to make sure those are segregated files. So as outlined, there are many considerations for employers to consider. And as the public health guidance continues to change, which I suspect it will, employers really just need to be flexible with their approach to returning employees to the workplace. So thank you.
Thank you, Kimberly. That's helpful information for employers and employees to understand as well. Our next speaker is David Autor. He is a Ford professor in the MIT Department of Economics, co-director of the NBER Labor Studies Program, and co-leader of both the MIT Work of the Future Task Force and the JPAL Work of the Future Experimental Initiative. He has received numerous awards, and he has been quoted by one magazine as, at least they refer to him as the academic voice of the American worker. He's going to talk to us today about the COVID crisis will reshape labor markets along at least three axes: telepresence, urban de-densification, and an accelerated pace of automation. Along these changes, although these changes will have long-run efficiency benefits, They will exacerbate economic pain in the short of medium terms for the least economically secure workers in our economy, particularly those in the rapidly growing but never highly paid personal services occupations. With that, I give you David.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Dennis. I hope you can all hear me. And so I'm speaking actually on behalf of the MIT Task Force on the Work of the Future, which I co-led with David Mindell and Elizabeth Reynolds, now serving on the National Economic Council. And my remarks will be brief, but I want to talk about the implications of the COVID crisis for low-paid employment going forward. So my colleague, David Mindell, who is both a historian of technology and an aeronautical and astronautical engineer, once remarked that telepresence is a form of automation, meaning being accomplishing one task while being somewhere else is a way of automating getting yourself there. And he originally made this remark about underwater drones, unmanned submarines, which is a technology that he pioneered. But this point applies very broadly, placing people at the bottom of the sea, in Earth's upper atmosphere, at a bomb disposal site, or in any physically hostile environment entails costly, energy-intensive life support systems that provide climate control, water delivery, waste disposal, et cetera. By obviating those needs, telepresence not only reduces costs, but also typically makes for better functionality. Machines unencumbered by physically present operators can accomplish tasks that would be perilous with human supports. These same lessons apply to workplaces. Though most workplaces are not overtly hostile to human life, they are expensive, duplicative places for performing tasks that many employees could telepresently accomplish from elsewhere, albeit with the loss of important social aspects of work. Not only is providing and maintaining physical offices costly for employers, it's expensive for employees. The Census Bureau estimates that US workers spend on average 225 hours per year commuting. Arguably, many of those of us who perform knowledge work have become so accustomed to the habit of being there that we fail to notice rapid improvements in next best alternative, which is not being there. So we're going to see a permanent shift towards greater telepresence. And this is a breakthrough. It's not a technological breakthrough. The big breakthrough is not that I'm using Zoom, it's that all of us are using Zoom simultaneously, right? It solved a coordination problem of everyone choosing all at once to invest in this technology and to agree that it was a good enough substitute for physical presence in many cases. However, the benefits are going to be highly unequally distributed. Workers of all wage levels want to work from home, but the feasibility and employer acceptance of work from home is going to be much greater for high-paid, highly educated workers. So here's a useful figure from a paper by Bararo, Bloom, and Davis recently. And they show, first of all, on the left-hand panel, you can see this is population density, so where people work. So this would be a rural area, a suburb, an urban, metropolitan area, a city. And you can see that people who work in dense urban areas spend a lot more money near work every week. So someone in New York City might spend an average of $300 a week near their office, whereas someone in a suburban area might spend $100 a week. Why do people spend more? Well, it's time intensive to commute. You're going to go there, you're going to eat lunch, you're going to buy coffee, you're going to buy gas, you're going to take people out to dinner and your clients and so on. And so a lot of urban service activity is supported by people working at expensive businesses. However, if you ask employers how much time do they anticipate their workers will work from home after the crisis, well, that's also strongly increasing in density. So people who work in dense urban offices, employers predict that they'll spend about a third of all days working from home, whereas people who work in suburban areas are predicting only 15%. So that matters because it means that those people who spend a lot of money downtown will spend less of it, right? They will go out less to restaurants, less to stores. They will require fewer office cleaners, fewer security personnel. We will see this likely exacerbated by a decline in business travel. I think the days in which people cross continents or oceans for a 90-minute meeting are coming to an end. It's not that all business travel will come to an end, but it's just costly, not just in terms of out-of-pocket costs, but in terms of time costs, the time people spend in transit, the time they spend adjusting to time zones. And that's really important because business travelers drive two sectors of the economy. One is, of course, air travel, but the other is hotel and accommodation, right? So both airlines and hotels have a kind of a dual customer model. You have the high out-of-pocket, the high-end customers, the business travelers, who basically pay the average cost of a hotel, of a flight. They pay, full fare on weeknights at a hotel, expensive hotels, and then they go out to the fancy restaurants or the overpriced hotel bar. And then you have the tourist travelers who basically pay marginal cost, right? They get the cheap seats on the plane, they get the weekend hotel rate, and so on. If we have fewer of those, that again means, not just fewer airline workers, of course, but fewer taxi and limo and Uber drivers, fewer hotel housekeepers, fewer people working at downtown restaurants, and so on. And so again, what this points to is a decline in demand for many of these personal services. And that's important. Leisure and hospitality accounted for 17 million jobs in December of 2019. That was about 11% of employment. This is a big sector, particularly for people without advanced degrees, particularly for immigrant workers, and so on. You can see the importance of this if you look at this figure, which shows you the growth of employment by major occupational category in the US between 1980 and 2015. You could extend this to 2020. These occupations are grouped from low paid to mid paid to high paid. And you see a kind of a barbell shape, right? On the one hand, we have a lot of growth in professional, technical, and managerial occupations. These are high education, high paid, interesting, creative, good jobs to have, a lot of security. On the other hand, we also have a disproportionate growth of personal services, food service, cleaning, entertainment, recreation, security, home health aides driven by demographics, and then a decline in many of the traditional middle skill, middle paid jobs, many of which were unionized, in production, in labor positions, in office administrative and sales. And so what this change in the structure of demand, especially dislocation out of urban areas, mean is a kind of a displacement of weight on one end of the barbell. You might think of poundage sliding off this side of the bar. And you can see that, one way you can see that is if you look at employment over the since January of 2020 in professional and business services, retail and transportation, and leisure and hospitality, right? The two upper sectors have basically almost fully rebounded, and leisure and hospitality is still down 25 or 20%, which is enormous. Now, some of it is still coming back. I don't think it'll be permanently down 25%, but I think it will be lower on a permanent basis. So what I want to, let me conclude and ruminate. So after the crisis, this plentiful source of low-paid work, I'm not saying that's good, but there was a lot of it, was growing. And I think that the pandemic is going to slow that down. And particularly, it's going to change the structure or the texture of cities and cause more people to live further out from central cities, to do less business travel. And this is going to slow down a phenomenon we've seen for at least 30 decades of kind of growing urban densification and what economists call agglomeration, meaning high-paid, high-skilled work in urban, right downtown. We will have less poundage on the low-wage end of the barbell, what I would say too few low-wage jobs. Long-term reductions in office occupancy and commuting will affect the structure of urban life, and the disruptions will fall heavily on urban low-paid workers in personal service occupations where there has been abundant numerical job growth. Now, there's an irony here. You might say, well, if these are low-wage jobs, don't we want fewer of them? Well, the reallocation of low-wage jobs is not good news if it means employers just have less need for labor. Decline in low-wage work will not raise demand for middle-paid work. The recession is already over for middle and high-paid workers. And the question is, what opportunities will present themselves for workers who've focused so much of the work in these low-paid occupations? Let me ruminate for one moment, because you might be saying, well, we seem to not have as many low-wage workers either. And it is the case in the US that labor markets are remarkably tight, given how much employment has declined. And I should note that's not unique to the United States. That's not exclusively because of our specific policies. You see that throughout continental Europe and certainly in the UK, which had a very different set of labor market policies for adapting to the pandemic. So we don't know. And if workers choose to do less low-wage work and find alternatives, that's good. That's going to cause employers to compete harder and pay higher wages. So that's great. My primary concern is, as with so many other, societal trends and technological phenomena, the benefits accrue disproportionately to highly skilled workers who have adaptive capabilities and also happen to do work that can be phoned in or zoomed in, and the costs or the disruptions and adjustments are borne much more heavily by people who are least well situated to have the resources and the investment opportunities to benefit as strongly. So let me stop there. Thank you very much for inviting me to the panel. Thanks for your attention, and I'll look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, David. We appreciate the conversation. So our next speaker is Rebecca Dixon. She is Executive Director of the National Employment Law Project, NELP. Rebecca is a respected national leader in federal workers' rights advocacy and in great demand for her thought leadership at the intersection of labor and racial equity. Rebecca's motivation for advancing workers' rights and commitment to economic justice is deeply rooted in her lived experience growing up in rural Mississippi. At the intersection of race, class, and gender, characteristics that have long defined our ability to participate in our democracy and economy. I'm going to also remind people, if you have questions for the panelists, please type them into the chat. Rebecca, to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So we know that the pandemic has really laid bare the challenges that many workers are facing before COVID. And so any kind of challenge or inequity that was in the labor market got modified by this. So we know that certain workers of color have always had a harder time finding work and finding work when they lose work. So all of that's magnified. And it's not just race and gender, but also things like age and immigration status as well. In order to create an equitable labor market, one where families and workers and their families are thriving, regardless of characteristics, is not a natural outcome of market forces. Corporations are not going to do this, but we do have the ability to create it with our institutions, laws, policies, and practices that govern our labor market and economy. Given the structural inequities in the pandemic, what is the futures for workers? So as David discussed, some recent research points to accelerated trends around digitization and automation, and leading to an economy where millions of low-wage jobs will disappear by 2030. Because of how our economy works, economic mobility, so moving up to a higher paid or higher skilled job, is not that easy in this country. Why is that? Well, the reasons are complex, but one of the reasons is occupational segregation. And when I say occupational segregation, I'm talking about labor market stratification, where pay level and job quality are intertwined with where you are in the labor market. And so we also see with occupational segregation a persistent concentration of women, workers of color, and immigrants in underpaid, insecure, unsafe jobs. So I would argue that this is not inevitable and it's not accidental, but it is a function of our accumulated local, state, and federal policies. So, and a recent example is that the prior administration in Washington used the Labor Department against working people and on behalf of corporations. But history is also littered with law and policy that excluded women and workers of color from fundamental rights like the right to a minimum wage, overtime protection, the right to organize, and benefits like unemployment insurance. And many of those exclusions haven't been fully rectified. Our economy is actually built on a hierarchy where 40% of jobs pay poverty level wages. So we're talking about something like 53 million people in the United States. 9 in 10 occupations are classified as racially segregated, even after you account for education. The blacker an occupation, the lower the wages. The more female an occupation, also the lower the pay, especially if it's care work. And women are concentrated in low-paid jobs. They make up 64% of the 40 lowest paying jobs. So that's the context. And the rest of my remarks will be focused on what's happening to those workers who are not working, what's happening to those who are working, some who are at risk, and lastly, how are workers viewing and experiencing this labor market disruption? So many are not working. I'm sure lots of you have seen the numbers of how many jobs we still need to gain. So one point of comparison is if you compare February of this year to February of last year, so when the pandemic started, we still are down 9.5 million jobs, and that's not accounting for jobs that we should have had job growth. So we're actually looking at a deficit that's closer to 12 million jobs. And we know these job losses have been uneven. In most recessions, the job losses are focused on men, or the majority of the folks who lose their jobs are men. But in this recession, it's been called a she-cession because it's women who were the majority of folks who lost their job. And low-wage workers have been hit the hardest in this recession. If you look at the year 2020, 80% of the losses were among the lowest quarter of wage earners. So really devastating for our low-wage workforce. And one of those industries was leisure and hospitality. And as in lots of other places in the labor market, women and workers of color saw disproportionate losses there. So what's supposed to happen if you lose your job? Well, what's supposed to happen is that the unemployment insurance system in this country is supposed to kick on as an automatic income support program so that families can meet their basic needs, but also it serves a purpose of buttressing the economy as well. So there's a couple of reasons why it didn't work as well this time around. One of them was probably the most visible, which is around technology. I'm sure lots of you saw the stories where people were unable to get through on the phone or on the internet to file for benefits. In the state of Florida, they had to take paper applications. So really, evidence of a long-term not having investment in that technology or in that program and its administration over time. And then the second reason is because the UI system is a federal state hybrid program. And what that means is that states have broad flexibility about eligibility and benefits. And so you have broad variations across the country. So benefits are closer to $1,200 or $1,100 a week as a maximum. So for the highest earners in Massachusetts versus $235 a week in Mississippi for the highest earners. And we wouldn't want those states to have the same amounts, but the amount in Mississippi has not grown over time to increase with wage growth. And so one of the things that we see in unemployment insurance and minimum wage in lots of places and things around working conditions, the southern states tend to be less protective. They tend to provide less benefits. And so with unemployment insurance, the southern states that have large Black populations also pay the lowest benefits. So for this recession, Congress had to step in and actually supplement benefit amounts so that people would have money for basic needs and so that the economy would not go into a downward spiral. And what they did is they added, you've all seen the $600 increase, which then was changed to a $300 weekly increase. And then also they expanded access to workers who are generally not eligible for UI. So part-time workers, workers who are working for low wages, and workers who are in the gig economy who are often misclassified as working for themselves when they actually are employees. So those folks all became eligible because of Congress. And what we're seeing now is that narratives really do have an impact on policy because employers now are saying that workers are sitting at home to collect the UI benefits. And 25 state governors have decided they're going to cut off the federal UI benefits as soon as next week. And this is actually counterproductive in terms of supporting the economy coming back, and also counterproductive in the ways that Congress intended for the CARES Act to take into consideration that there are workers, especially women, who are caregivers and who can't return to the workforce right now because the care infrastructure is just not there. So though there are also folks working. So lots of folks early in this pandemic were working while they were at risk, and we've heard them called essential workers, we've heard them called frontline workers, but they were really treated as disposable. They were the ones taking the risks, and they were doing it in an environment where there's very little protection in terms of legal protection around their right to health and safety. These workers were definitely concentrated in as Black, Latinx, and immigrant workers. And those workers have always had the most dangerous jobs. So this is actually not new. Cashiers are actually the largest number of workers who were at risk earlier in the pandemic, and they also are among some of the folks who received the least protections and the lowest pay. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the federal government, is supposed to be the one that looks out for health and safety for workers, but they were basically missing in action in this pandemic. They didn't issue any enforceable standards for workers to have rights to PPE or distancing or any of those common sense practices. And so a worker didn't have a right to enforce that. So an employer could say, I'm not providing it, and there's no recourse. And if the worker was retaliated against, they were also relying on OSHA to help them in that situation, and they were also missing in action in that situation. So what does all this mean for workers? The pandemic has really caused a shift in how workers are thinking about the labor market, thinking about their jobs, thinking about their employers. They're actually seeing that they have so little protection. Lots of them don't have paid sick leave, and they don't have protections from being fired arbitrarily. They don't have protections around health and safety. And so what we've been seeing is an impact on worker organizing. So when you have a crisis like this, you can either end up with like it's an opportunity to change and to fix what's wrong with the labor market, or it can leave things more deeply entrenched. And so what we're seeing is workers banding together, organizing around unemployment insurance, organizing around health and safety, actually walking out of their jobs. They don't, in some cases, in a lot of these cases, have access to a union. So there's this growing bubbling up of workers basically saying they've had enough. And so really what happens from this point is going to depend on employers and policymakers and what choices they make. Do they make it easier for workers to organize by passing something like the PRO Act, or do we stay business as usual? And so my hope is that we take this opportunity to actually fix the inequities in the system, and that's going to be better for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all of our speakers. We have a number of questions in the chat. We only have about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to just pick a couple of them to ask, and then we'll squeeze as many in as we can. David, one of the questions is, how would several years of a hot labor market, say around 3.5% unemployment, affect the structural changes you described, particularly for those who have traditionally held those low-wage service jobs impacted by these changes?
Sure. I mean, tight labor markets do a lot of good. Over the last several years of very tight labor markets, we saw people with, adverse criminal histories finding new employment opportunities. The population rate of people with work-limiting disabilities has increased substantially over the last decade after falling for 20 years after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It helps. Tight labor markets also encourage employers to invest in people who don't have specific skills and train them up. So I think there's a lot to recommend for tight labor markets. And I think the Biden administration is well aware of that, and they're trying to run the economy as hot as possible without, while keeping their eye open for inflation. So, programs are great, but if you, and we need to invest in people, there are a lot of things we need to do. And as Rebecca was emphasizing, we need to change the structure of employment protections and the social safety net. However, The thing that is most effective in the short run in creating upward mobility and putting upward wage pressure, especially in lower paid jobs, is a low unemployment rate. So I hope we'll see that. And I'm actually encouraged that people are coming back to work slowly, because it's exactly causing employers to have to work a little harder to attract them.
Thank you, David. Another quick question for any of you is whether this is going to be or is a transformative moment in terms of work, or will things revert back?
I can take a stab at that one. I think it's a transformative moment. I think we have to manage our expectations about how transformative in the space of 1 year. But I do think it has set into motion things that maybe will cause transformative change in 5 years, right? As opposed to everything happening this year.
Thank you, Rebecca. And here's one for you, Kimberly. If employers force employees to get vaccinated and employees have a very adverse reaction or possibly even die, could the employer be held somehow liable?
Well, I think that's why the EEOC has come out with its guidance, which says employers can mandate the vaccine, to give some coverage to employers who make the decision to mandate the vaccination. And I think that's where I mentioned, what you might start to see is that you'll have plaintiffs' attorneys trying to bring claims under tort law, workers' compensation claims, if an individual were to have some type of adverse reaction because the employer has mandated the vaccine. It remains to be seen. I think that there will be an uphill battle in that space for an employee who would unfortunately have an adverse reaction. But again, it remains to be seen. We have not seen a lot of litigation around this because it's still too novel right now.
Thank you, Kimberly. David, there's one very long question in here. If you get a chance, maybe you can respond to that in the chat. In the last minute that we have left, I want to again thank our panelists, Kimberly, David, and Rebecca. We appreciate each of you. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us here today. And I would ask, do any of you have any last final comment for the group before we sign off?
Thank you.
I'll make one. So first, I want to say thanks. Second of all, in terms of just responding to the question about transformativeness, I think there's an opportunity, and whether we seize it successfully or not is up to us and up to the people we have put into office. There was a transformative opportunity after the great financial crisis, but things were not transformed. So hopefully we'll be able to seize the momentum more effectively on this occasion.
Thank you, David. Again, thank you all for attending. It's now 3 o'clock, so on to the next session. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.